Christian heroes then and now. David Livingstone, Africa's Trailblazer, by Janet and Geoff Benge. Chapter 12, Where Others Have Not Planted. When David Livingstone first heard about the Boers, he had been impressed with their courage and determination. After all, over 6,000 people, men, women, and children, had trekked northward from the coastal towns of Port Elizabeth and Cape Town into uncharted regions. In the process, they founded the republics of Orange Free State, Natal, and Transvaal. Their exodus north from the coast, known as the Great Trek, began in 1835, 6 years before David arrived in southern Africa. Now, though, these trekkers were David's neighbors, and David began to understand better who they were and why they had left the coast in the first place. It was very simple, really. The Boers were descended from Dutch colonists who had arrived in southern Africa from Holland in the 17th century and had established large farms for themselves. After they had enslaved the Hottentot tribes who lived on the coast at the time, things generally went smoothly for the next 150 years. The Boers had everything they wanted: free labor, large tracts of land, and no one telling them what to do. But that all changed in 1814, when the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost part of the African continent, fell into British hands. British law, which soon included a ban on owning slaves, prevailed there. Through the efforts of William Wilberforce in England, slavery had been outlawed in all British territories by 1833. This meant that the Boers had to free their slaves and find some other way to work their land. Understandably, the Boers were not happy at this turn of events. How dare the British tell them how they should run their lives, they protested. However, when the Boers realized the British were serious and they would be forced to give up their slaves, they decided to abandon their farms and move northward away from prying British eyes. So the Great Trek began. Within a few years, most Boers had abandoned the coastal areas and headed inland. From the time David arrived in Cape Town and then in Port Elizabeth, he had not wanted to live around large groups of white people. He hated the constant arguing and bickering, and he wanted to live and work with native people far away from the influence of traders and slave owners. However, to the east of Kolobeng lay a settlement of Boers who had made the Great Trek. These people were not happy to have David for a neighbor. They had already made slaves of 6 trades in the area and now had their eyes on Chief Sekele and the Bokwains. It would be a simple enough matter for the Boers to round up this tribe, except for one thing. David Livingstone lived among them. The Boers did everything they could to get David and his family to leave the area. They forbade David to preach the gospel message in their territory and told him that if he sent a native agent to preach in his place, they would kill the agent. David stood firm, however, and would not be intimidated into leaving. Eventually, the Boers got tired of waiting for David to leave and decided to attack the Bokwains at Kolobeng, whether David was there or not. Their plan for the raid was simple, just like all of their other raids. They would force unarmed Africans from other tribes to go with them. When they reached the village they wanted to attack, they would push the unarmed natives to the front and use them as human shields. From behind the unarmed Africans, The Boers would fire at the village. If the people in the village tried to fight back in any way, the unarmed Africans, not the Boers, would be killed. When the fighting was over, the Boers would take the women and children captive and plunder the village. David heard a rumor about the Boers' intentions, and sure enough, soon afterwards a messenger arrived from the Boers commanding Chief Sekele to surrender rather than face the death or enslavement of his entire tribe. The Boers' actions enraged David, who climbed onto a horse and rode 300 miles to Boer headquarters to protest what was about to happen. When David arrived, he was met by several hundred men, saddled and ready to join the fight to enslave the Bokwains and take their land. Each man was armed with a rifle, while there were only 5 guns in the whole of Colenbeng. If the Boers were ever allowed to go through with their plan, a tremendous slaughter would take place in the village. David was appalled and went straight to their commander. After many angry exchanges and numerous threats, the commander finally agreed to call off the raid on Colenbeng. However, he refused to promise that there would be no attack on the area at some time in the future. What changed the commander's mind was David's threat to write and tell people in England and Europe what the Boers were doing. David knew this would touch a raw nerve, since the reason the Boers wanted him out of the village was so that there would be no European witnesses to their actions. The Boers themselves were not proud of the tactics they used in battle and did not want people observing them and telling others about them. So David's threat to tell people in Europe what the Boers were up to changed the Boers' minds about attacking Colenbeng and won the day. David was saddened by the whole situation. Africa might be vast, but the areas where native people could live without interference from the Boers was shrinking each year. As he thought about the situation, David decided he had to find a path north through the Kalahari Desert. If he found such a path, perhaps he could lead the Bokwains out of the reach of the Boers. However, mounting an expedition to search for a route north through the vast Kalahari was expensive. Since David had already borrowed against his yearly stipend from the London Missionary Society, he could not afford to buy oxen, horses, and supplies, and hire the men he would need to accompany him. Still, he would not give up on the idea. There had to be some way to finance such a trip. He would just have to find it. David wrote to many people explaining his desire to travel north and search for a path across the Kalahari Desert. One of the people he wrote to was his old friend Captain Thomas Steele, one of the hunters who had traveled north with David and Roger Edwards on their trip from Kuruman to establish the mission station at Mabatsa. Although Captain Steele was too busy to make a trip into the Kalahari Desert, his friend Cotton Oswell had the time and interest to make such a trip. Cotton Oswell was a civil servant from India who loved to visit Africa to hunt wild animals. He came from a very wealthy family and had plenty of money to spend on such pursuits. One day in December 1848, David received a letter from him. "Mary, I don't believe it. Listen to this," he exclaimed as he read the letter. Mary set her basket of laundry down and gave David her full attention. "What is it?" she asked. "It's a letter from Cotton Oswell. He has landed at Port Elizabeth and is ready to mount an expedition into the Kalahari. He says, I have engaged 10 servants, purchased 2 wagons, 20 horses, and 80 oxen. As I write to you, they are being loaded up with 300 pounds of coffee, 400 pounds of tea, 100 pounds of salt, 400 pounds of sugar, 2 cases of brandy, a box of soap, 10 pounds of pepper, 3 bottles of mustard, and an assortment of buckets, silverware, dishes, and kettles. In addition to the food I have a telescope, a sextant, gunpowder, and cartridges. He goes on to say, I would be honored if we could join forces on this venture. David looked up at his wife, his eyes shining with delight. God answers prayer, Mary exclaimed. Why, David, everything he lists in his letter must have cost him 600 pounds at least to buy. And he's invited you along with him. How wonderful. Cotton Oswell also said in his letter that he would be passing through Kolobeng in March. Along the way, he was going to collect his friend Mungo Murray, another hunter who would accompany them on the trip. This was the best news David had heard in weeks, and he began immediately making preparations for Cotton Oswell's arrival. David tried to convince Chief Sekele to go along with him, but with the threat of a Boer attack still hanging over the village, the chief felt he should stay home with his people. However, David did recruit 30 Bokwe warriors and guides to join him. He could not afford to pay them, but he promised to make room in his wagon for the tusks of any elephants they managed to hunt down. The ivory from the tusks was worth a lot of money in Port Elizabeth and Cape Town. David had often heard the Bokwains talking about a great lake in the Kalahari Desert. The Bokwains called it Lake Nagmi, and David had set his sights on finding it. He had learned the hard way that a mission station must be situated beside a steady supply of water, and Lake Nagmi could be such a place. Although he had never met Cotton Oswell, David was certain that any friend of Captain Steele's would be a good and honest man. Indeed, he had been so impressed with Thomas Steele that when Mary gave birth to their third child, he named the boy Thomas Steele Livingstone. Now David waited anxiously for Cotton Oswell and his party to arrive. When the men finally arrived at Kolobeng, David soon discovered he had been right. He and Cotton Oswell liked each other from the moment they met. Cotton Oswell had no objection to looking for Lake Nagmi, and he was delighted to find that David could speak some of the local dialects. The expedition left Kolobeng on June 1st, 1849. First, it headed northwest to a village called Sorodal, 120 miles from Kolobeng. Sorodal was on the edge of the Kalahari Desert and was the last point marked on the map. It was a sobering moment for everyone as the group passed the last point known to white men. No one knew what lay beyond. Passing Sorodal, the expedition entered the territory of Chief Sakomi of the Bamangwato tribe. The chief seemed friendly enough and insisted that 2 of his men accompany the party to act as scouts to find water for the 80 oxen, 20 horses, and 45 men who needed a large supply of water each day. Before long, David began to suspect that the guides were actually leading them away from water. Although the Kalahari did not appear to have rivers or streams, there was water to be found if a person knew where to look. In places, the rainwater collected about 5 or 6 feet underground on top of pans of limestone. If a person dug very carefully in the right spot, he could find these pools of underground water. Since David had no idea where to dig for this water, the party wasted many hours each day digging furiously with spades and turtle shell scoops. Sometimes they found a little water, but it was never enough for all the people and animals. They whipped the oxen mercilessly to keep them moving, but no amount of whipping could induce the animals to walk for more than 6 hours a day over the burning hot desert. The situation became desperate by the time they had been traveling for a month. They were 120 miles into the desert and too exhausted to turn back. They had to find a good supply of water, and fast. As David contemplated their desperate situation, something caught his eye. It was a small, naked figure running silently into the nearby bushes. "Quick, over there!" David yelled to Cotton Oswell, who was riding a horse. "I think I saw someone over there." Cotton Oswell turned his horse in the direction David was pointing and clicked his stirrups. 5 minutes passed before he returned, walking his horse. A woman from a Bushman tribe was trotting alongside him. "Thank goodness you found someone," David exclaimed. "I just wish we had some way to talk to her. I can't say a word in the dialect the Bushmen speak. It's all clicks and popping noises. Very difficult, really," he muttered as he climbed into the back of the wagon. He emerged a moment later with a string of glass beads and a leg of cooked gemsbok, which he held out to the woman, who smiled and grabbed them. "She understood that all right," grinned Cotton Oswell. "Now if we can just get her to tell us where to find water." The two men did a pantomime, scooping up imaginary water with their hands and drinking it slowly. The woman smiled again and pointed to the north. "I think she understands," said Cotton Oswell. "Come on, let's swing the wagons around and see if she will lead us." David nodded. "It's our only hope," he said. Then he added glumly, "I hope she isn't tricking us like those Bamangwatos we had to send back." The expedition followed the bushwoman on late into the afternoon. "Keep your eyes on her. We don't want her to disappear on us," David cautioned his Bokwain helpers. He need not have been concerned. Suddenly, the oxen and horses became excited, kicking and lunging forward. "Water," said Cotton Oswell. "They must smell water." Sure enough, just ahead of them was a large spring surrounded by low bushes. While several men stood guard watching for lions, the oxen were unyoked and led down to the cool, clear water. "It's wonderful," laughed David, splashing around in the water. When he turned to thank the bushwoman for leading them to the spring, the woman was gone, and he scoured the horizon for some sight of her. David thought he saw something, not the woman, but something else. He squinted and looked harder into the distance. Could it be true, or was he seeing things? Far in the distance was a ribbon of shimmering water lined with large trees. "Look over there," he called to Cotton Oswell. "Do you see anything?" Cotton Oswell shaded his eyes against the setting sun and stared hard. His eyes widened with amazement, and his mouth dropped open. A river! I see a river!" David nodded with relief and excitement. He had been worried it was just a mirage. The next day, July 4th, 1849, however, the river was still there, lying tantalizingly in the distance. With plenty of water in their bellies, the oxen didn't take long to cross the distance to the river. By mid-afternoon, the members of the expedition were standing on the edge of the Zuga River, the most beautiful sight David had ever seen. Stretching to the north and south on either side of the river was a line of lush trees that shaded the sparkling clear water. David took readings with his sextant and carefully recorded the spot on his map. He felt exhilarated. No white man knew about this river, and here he was, standing at the edge of it. David felt sure that if they followed the river north, it would lead them to Lake Nagmi. And he was right. 27 days later, and 280 miles farther north, the river broadened into a large, shallow lake. On August 1st, 1849, 2 months to the day since he left Kolobeng, David, along with Cotton Oswell and Mungo Murray, was standing on the banks of Lake Nagmi. This was one of the greatest moments of his life. David estimated the broad and shallow lake to be about 70 miles in circumference, and no more than chest deep at its deepest point. The lake swarmed with all kinds of animal life. Large herds of elephants and buffalo trampled the vegetation on the shoreline. Dainty antelopes darted about, and crocodiles bobbed their heads in and out of the still water. What seemed like a million different birds flew overhead or waited among the reeds at the water's edge. David was charmed by it all, but most of all he was inspired with thoughts of a mission station on the lake edge. He could hardly wait to get back to Kolobeng to write to the London Missionary Society to inform them of his wonderful find. The trip back was much less taxing. The men retraced their steps, following the Zuga River south for 300 miles, and then heading off into the Kalahari. This time, though, they had David's map to guide them. On his map, David had marked all the spots where they had been able to find at least some water on the trip north, and once again they stopped at these spots. Chief Sukomi was astonished to see the members of the expedition alive and well. He had been certain they would perish in the desert, and the two guides he had sent with them had tried their hardest to make sure that happened. But the men hadn't perished. They had made it all the way to Lake Ngami and back. On the trip, Cotton Oswell had shot an enormous bull elephant with tusks weighing over 100 pounds apiece. The Bokwains had killed some smaller elephants and collected the tusks to sell to ivory traders on the coast. Everyone returned from the trip happy. David's family was glad to see David. It had been 4 months and 9 days since David had left. Agnes, aged 2.5, was now chattering ceaselessly, and even baby Thomas dazzled his father by giving him a broad smile from his crib. Upon his return to Kolobeng, David wrote letters to his family in Scotland and to David Steele in India. He also wrote to Arthur Tidman at the London Missionary Society office in London. After describing his adventure, he ended the letter by saying, "I hope to be permitted to work as long as I live, beyond other men's line of things, and plant the seed of the gospel where others have not planted." In contrast to the success of the trip to discover Lake Ngami was a visit to Kolobeng by the Reverend John Freeman, a director of the London Missionary Society. The Reverend Freeman was visiting all the LMS missions in southern Africa. The last mission he visited was Kolobeng to see David Livingstone. The Reverend Freeman did not say much about what he saw there, but what he did say was depressing. He was surprised at how few converts David had to show for his 8 years of missionary work, and he did not feel that the school was being run as well as it should be. The Reverend Freeman thought that David had neglected his missionary work and told him as much. David tried to explain that it was not easy converting natives and that he thought that an important part of his work was finding a safe area for the Bokwains to live in, as well as opening up new areas for missionaries to work in. By the time the Reverend Freeman had left, David realized he had a serious decision to make. He had to admit he was not a very good stay-in-one-place missionary. His heart was in traveling, in spending a day or a week or a month with an unknown tribe, and beginning the process of helping them to understand the gospel message. The question was, how could he arrange things so that he could do this? Where would the money come from to do it? And most important, what would his family do while he was away in unmapped and unexplored areas?